Nightmares by the J-Boy88. A place of science and experimentation. That would be the thought one would have when seeing this room for the first time. Filled with gadgets and gizmos of all stripes, this was clearly the abode of a scientist. And while not dark per se, the lighting was nowhere near as bright as it was in the other parts of Canterlot High. Even so, its lone occupant, Twilight Sparkle, formerly of Crystal Prep, did not seem at all fazed by her surroundings, regardless of the lighting. Rather, she was instead focusing on the documents and books that lay upon the desk before her. On and on she read, muttering to herself all the way.
Maybe. No, that's not it. Or maybe...
So engrossed was she in her work that she failed to notice the door of her laboratory open up, revealing her friend, Sunset Shimmer, now entering the place herself. The former unicorn glanced around the lab for a few moments before, finally, addressing the one she had come here for to begin with.
Hey, Twilight. How's it going?
The moment her words had been spoken, the young scientist looked up from her book, spinning around in her chair to see the new arrival, and while not unhappy exactly, she was nevertheless surprised to see her. Adjusting her glasses slightly, Twilight replied,
"Oh, hey, Sunset. I wasn't expecting you."
Smiling, Sunset began to explain her presence here.
"I thought I'd come over to see how you were doing. How's the new lab holding up?"
Here, at last, Twilight could crack a smile of her own. Looking around to her surroundings, she gave her an answer.
"It's wonderful. Just like my old one back at Crystal Prep."
Chuckling slightly, Sunset looked around herself for a few moments.
"Yeah, I knew you'd be able to make this room useful for something."
Her expression then became a touch softer as she continued.
"Anyways, the girls and me are getting some milkshakes. You want to come?"
At that, Twilight's smile faded, and she turned instead to the books and documents on her desk, almost as if trying to avoid Sunset's gaze.
"Thanks for the offer, but I'm kind of in the middle of some work."
Sunset raised an eyebrow.
"Oh? Research? What about?"
A look of nervousness crossed Twilight's face.
"Well, I'm not sure I should..."
Recognizing that her friend was concerned about something, Sunset continued with her soft expression, taking a step closer to the girl before speaking to her in a calmer tone than before.
"Twilight, we're friends. Whatever's eating at you, you can tell me."
The other girl weighed those words carefully, switching between trust and apprehension in her expression several times before, in the end, letting out a sigh.
"Well, okay. I guess I could tell you."
Briefly, she turned back to her desk, picking up a few of her notes and holding them close to her as she looked to Sunset once more.
"I've been doing some research on the subject of recurring dreams."
After speaking that, Twilight took a look on of clear embarrassment.
"Specifically, my dreams."
Sunset started to look at her friend with a degree of concern.
"A dream? What about?"
Twilight said nothing for a few moments, instead glancing over to the door of the room. Sunset had closed it behind her as she entered, but even so, Twilight regarded it warily, as if somebody might enter at a moment's notice. Eventually, she spoke in a quiet manner to her friend.
"Do you promise not to tell anybody?"
Giving a reassuring smile, Sunset nodded.
"I give you my word."
Twilight sighed, visibly relieved to hear that, and after a moment or two of silence between the girls, she started to speak up again.
"Okay, the dream starts out in my room. It's the night before our big school trip. You know, to Camp Everfree."
Sunset nodded, prompting Twilight to continue.
"I'm getting myself ready, picking out the right clothes and stuff. Everything starts out fine, but..."
A grimace appeared on the girl's face.
"That's when I see... her."
Sunset's face was one of confusion.
"Her? Her who?"
Twilight shut her eyes, almost as if she was ashamed of looking at Sunset as she gave her answer.
"Midnight Sparkle."
Sunset's eyes widened, and immediately her expression was one of realization and understanding.
"Oh, I see."
Again, a silence was felt between the two, and for a moment, Sunset seemed to feel clear guilt at having asked Twilight to reveal this information. As for Twilight herself, she kept quiet, looking away from her friend, and, quite frankly, was looking a little more uncomfortable with this whole situation. But, in the end, the silence broke when Sunset finally spoke up.
"What happens next?"
Looking at her at last, Twilight continued.
"She's in my room and she just laughs. I don't even know what she's laughing at. I'm terrified. I start to back away."
The girl hesitated for a moment.
But the ground breaks from underneath me and I'm not going anywhere.
Her hands balled into fists upon her knees when she carried on.
Midnight is in control now and I can't get away from her.
Sunset took a cautious step forward.
And then...
Turning, Twilight looks at her.
And then she just...
She turned away, shutting her eyes tight and bearing a look of discomfort upon herself as she recalls the events of the dream more and more.
She wins, Sunset. She just... wins.
Sunset looked to her friend, feeling nothing but regret at having this conversation started, but even in spite of that, she speaks softly to her.
That sounds... terrible.
As Twilight's expression became somewhat blank, she adjusted her glasses slightly.
Yes, it was.
Sunset thought long and hard about what she had just been told, and in the end asked perhaps the only thing she could think of under the circumstances.
Did anything else happen in the dream? Maybe someone there besides you and Midnight?
As before, Twilight's face formed into a grimace, albeit very briefly, and much like she did a few minutes ago, she turned her face away from her friend.
Yes, but I don't want to talk about it.
Immediately, a flood of guilt washed over Sunset, and she looked at Twilight and spoke to her in an apologetic tone.
Twilight, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have...
But Twilight raised a hand, stopping her before she spoke any further.
No, it's fine.
For a time, she was able to give a small smile for her friend.
I'm actually glad you were here to listen to this.
Letting out a deep sigh, the scientist turned her attention yet again to her books and notes, using them as something to focus on rather than the dream she had been discussing.
Anyways, I've been doing research into possible causes for all of this.
Gaining a smile of her own, Sunset approached her friend's desk, looking over the documents in question and very much seeming like she too wanted to lighten the discussion.
Oh? Let's see.
And see she did, for Sunset now gazed upon a plethora of these things and books devoted to the subjects of dreams, nightmares, and their causes. Names she didn't recognize with writing she largely didn't understand, was all arrayed before her, leading to a great deal of confusion as she attempted to take in the information provided to her. In the end, she let out a sigh, speaking to Twilight in a more serious manner.
Twilight, I know you've put a lot of thought into this, but...
However, once again, Sunset was prevented from saying anything as Twilight let out another sigh.
I know. It's just my guilt.
Sunset looked to her, her eyes widened in surprise.
Wait, you already knew? But then why...
Scooting her chair closer to her desk, Twilight answered in a rather somber fashion.
Doing research just... it helps.
For a time, Sunset said nothing. She simply stared at the back of her friend's head, seeing her looking down to her notes and her books. The equestrian tried thinking of something to say to her, to help her get her out of this low mood she'd been placed in, but, for a time, nothing came to her. She thought and thought for so long that a good 5 minutes of silence passed between them before she managed to say something, finally.
Twilight, I know how you feel.
But Twilight did not reply to that, prompting Sunset to continue.
I really do.
She looked away, her expression becoming one of slight guilt herself.
Long before we met, I was... a different person, and...
She shut her eyes tightly.
I made a lot of bad choices.
As she spoke those words, she allowed the memories of those early days to return to the forefront of her mind. Her terrible attitude, her misguided grabs for power and influence, even the fateful night of the fall formal. All these memories and more came to her, causing her no end of discomfort, but she powered through it, as she'd so often learned to do in recent years, and as she turned again to Twilight, her tone softened.
Those choices haunt me, even to this day, and they probably will for the rest of my life.
A small grimace formed upon her lips.
I know better than anyone else how easy it is to dwell on the past, and how many sleepless nights it can give you.
Then her dour expression was replaced with a small smile.
But you have to understand, you're not alone anymore. Me and the other girls, we're here for you.
But like before, Twilight said nothing, not even turning to look upon Sunset as she said that. Slowly, the latter's smile faded slightly.
I just thought you should know that.
Again, silence was the order of the day, but thankfully, it was comparatively short-lived as Twilight at last spoke up in response.
Thank you, Sunset.
Sunset's smile returned and she gave a brief nod.
It's no problem.
To that, Twilight turned around in her chair, looking to the former unicorn with an almost regretful expression.
No, I mean it. You're right. I shouldn't have let myself obsess over this.
Her eyes flickered away for a moment.
I'm sorry for dragging you into my problems.
A chuckle escaped Sunset after hearing that.
Hey, you're not the only girl who's been down that road, remember?
She raised a hand, gesturing to the speculated girl.
And I'm just happy you were willing to trust me with something like this.
For a few seconds, a look of thoughtfulness crossed Sunset's face.
Actually, now that we've sorted this out...
A smile returned to her.
Do you maybe want to meet up with the other girls now?
It took a while, but eventually the young scientist returned the smile, giving a nod of acceptance before finally getting up and out of her chair. After taking a few minutes to brush down her skirt, she walked over to her companion.
I'd love to.
A brief flicker of hesitancy was seen in her eyes, and after looking back to her desk a few seconds, Twilight finally spoke up again.
And Sunset?
Sunset looked at her with curiosity.
Yeah?
Clasping her hands together in front of her, Twilight slowly looked Sunset in the eye, bearing a look of contentment.
Just thank you for, being there for me.
Taking these words in, Sunset regained her own smile, which was even wider than before gently placing her hand upon her friend's shoulder.
We always will be, Twilight. We always will be.
The end.